There's a version of my life that still exists on paper. Same address. Same names. Same routines, technically. But it doesn't feel like mine anymore. I still wake up at the same time. Still move through the same rooms. Still hear the same small sounds that used to mean everything was okay. The quiet hum in the background. The soft closing of doors. The kind of silence that used to feel settled. Now it just feels empty. Not the kind of empty that comes from being alone. The kind that shows up when something is missing, but no one else can see it's gone. I didn't think I'd ever be the kind of person who would question everything all at once. Not like this. Not quietly. Not without anything actually exploding. That's the part that stays with me. Nothing exploded. There was no moment where everything shattered in front of me. No dramatic scene I could point to and say, that's when it all ended. It was already over by the time I realized something was wrong. And somehow, that makes it worse. Because I didn't lose something in a single moment. I lost it slowly, without noticing. There are things I can't look at the same way anymore. Simple things. Ordinary things. Like sitting across from someone and assuming you know what they're thinking. Or hearing a familiar tone in their voice and not questioning it. Or believing that the life you've built together is exactly what it looks like from the outside. I used to trust that feeling. That quiet certainty that nothing was being hidden from me. I don't think I even knew how much I relied on it until it was gone. Now, every memory feels slightly off. Like I'm replaying scenes that look the same, but mean something different. There's a version of me in those memories who didn't see anything wrong. Who sat there, completely unaware. And I keep wondering what I missed. What was right in front of me that I just didn't notice? It wasn't anything big at first. That's what makes it hard to explain. If I try to describe it, it sounds like nothing. A pause that lasted a second too long. A response that didn't quite match the question. A look that disappeared the moment I focused on it. The kind of thing you brush off immediately because it doesn't come with proof. Just a feeling. And I remember that moment more clearly than anything else. Not because I knew something was wrong. But because I almost ignored it. I almost let it pass like everything else. Told myself I was overthinking. That it didn't matter. That there was no reason to question anything. I was standing right there, on the edge of something I couldn't see yet. And all it took was noticing. Just noticing. That was it. No evidence. No confrontation. No answers. Just a quiet shift I couldn't explain. But once I felt it, I couldn't go back to not feeling it. That's the thing about doubt. It doesn't need proof to exist. And once it's there, it changes how everything else looks. Even the things you thought were solid. Even the things you never imagined questioning. I didn't know it then. But that was the moment something started to break. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough that nothing would ever feel the same again. And the worst part is, I still don't know if I crossed a line just by paying attention. Or if that was the only moment I was actually honest with myself. If stories like this hit close to home, or make you question things you felt but couldn't explain, you're not alone. Subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray, like the video, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. If you had asked me back then, I would have told you everything was solid. Not perfect. I don't think I ever believed in perfect. But steady. Predictable in a good way. The kind of life where you stop questioning things because nothing has ever given you a reason to. We had a rhythm. That's probably the best way to describe it. Days moved in patterns you could rely on. Mornings weren't rushed, evenings weren't chaotic. Conversations didn't feel forced. Even the quiet moments felt shared, like we both understood what they meant without having to say anything. I took a lot of comfort in that. I think I built more of my identity around it than I realized at the time. Being the one who kept things together. The one who made sure everything ran smoothly. If something needed to be handled, I handled it. If something felt off, I was the one trying to fix it before it became a problem. I didn't mind that role. It felt like responsibility. Like commitment. Like proof that I was doing things right. And she was different in a way that balanced that out. More expressive. More reactive. She felt things openly, said what was on her mind, moved through emotions faster than I did. Where I tried to keep things steady, she made things feel alive. At least, that's how I understood it. If something bothered her, she would say it. If something didn't matter, she'd brush it off quickly. There wasn't much in between. I used to think that was honesty. That if there was ever a real problem, I would know immediately. That nothing important would ever be hidden. Looking back, I think I trusted that assumption more than I trusted anything else. Because it meant I didn't have to question what I couldn't see. We built things over time. Shared responsibilities. Shared decisions. The kind of long-term planning that only makes sense if you believe you're heading in the same direction. There were moments I felt proud of that. Not in a loud way. Just quietly. Like when everything was taken care of, and nothing felt unstable. When you could sit down at the end of the day and not feel like something was about to fall apart. That kind of stability becomes invisible after a while. You stop noticing it because it's always there. And I think that's where I got comfortable. Too comfortable, maybe. I didn't question small changes because I didn't expect them to mean anything. If she seemed distracted one night, I assumed she was tired. If a conversation felt shorter than usual, I figured we just didn't have much to say. There was always an explanation that made sense at the time. And I was good at finding those explanations. Better than I should have been. I avoided conflict when I could. Not because I was afraid of it, but because it felt unnecessary. If something could be smoothed over, I'd rather do that than turn it into something bigger. She used to say that about me sometimes. That I overthought things. That I tried too hard to keep everything balanced. Not everything needs fixing, she told me once. I remember that because it stuck with me. At the time, I took it as reassurance. Like she was telling me to relax. To trust what we had. So I did. I trusted the routine. I trusted the way things had always worked. I trusted that if anything serious ever came up, it wouldn't stay hidden. And maybe that was the real problem. Not that I ignored anything obvious. But that I believed nothing important could exist without making itself known. I didn't see myself as someone who could be blindsided. I thought I paid attention. I thought I understood the person I was building a life with. And for a long time, there was nothing that contradicted that belief. Nothing that forced me to look closer. Nothing that made me question the version of reality I was living in. Which is why, when that feeling finally showed up, it didn't just challenge what I thought I knew. It made me wonder if I had ever really been paying attention at all. It didn't change all at once. If it had, I think I would have reacted differently. There would have been something clear to point at. Something undeniable. A moment where I could say, this is where things shifted. But that's not how it happened. It was quieter than that. At first, it was just a difference in energy. Not even something I could explain. Just a feeling that conversations didn't land the same way anymore. Like there was a slight delay between what was said and how it was received. She still talked. Still moved through the same routines. Still showed up where she was supposed to. But something felt slightly out of sync. I noticed it in small moments. The way she would check her phone and angle the screen just a little differently than before. Not hiding it exactly. Just adjusting it. Or how she'd respond to simple questions with answers that felt complete, but somehow didn't invite anything further. Everything good? Yeah, just busy. It wasn't wrong. It just wasn't anything. And that started happening more often. Conversations that used to stretch out naturally began to end early. Not abruptly. Just shorter. Like there was less to say, even when there should have been more. At first, I didn't question it. People get tired. Work gets stressful. Life shifts. There was always a reasonable explanation available, and I took it every time. I think I wanted to. Because the alternative meant assuming something was wrong without having proof. And I didn't want to be that person. The one who creates problems out of nothing. So I adjusted instead. If she seemed distracted, I gave her space. If conversations felt off, I didn't push them. If something didn't sit right, I told myself it would pass. That's what you're supposed to do, right? Trust the person you're with. Don't overanalyze every detail. Don't turn small things into big issues. I repeated that to myself more than I'd like to admit. But the feeling didn't go away. It didn't grow all at once either. It just stayed. Lingering in the background. Like something unfinished. There were moments where it almost disappeared. A normal conversation. A familiar laugh. Something that made everything feel like it used to. And I'd think, see? It's nothing. But then something small would happen again. A pause before answering a question that didn't need thinking. A shift in tone that didn't match the situation. A kind of distance that wasn't physical, but still felt real. And I started noticing how often I was the one trying to close that gap. Asking questions. Starting conversations. Trying to bring things back to what they used to feel like. She would respond. She wasn't cold. But it felt contained. Like everything had boundaries now that didn't exist before. I remember one night in particular. We were sitting in the same room, doing separate things. Nothing unusual about that. It used to feel comfortable. But that night, it felt different. I looked over at her, and for a second, it felt like I was looking at someone who was somewhere else entirely. Not physically. Just mentally gone. I almost said something. I almost asked what she was thinking. But I didn't. Because what was I supposed to base that on? A feeling? So I let it go. And that became a pattern. Noticing something. Almost addressing it. Then deciding not to. Every time, it felt like the reasonable choice. Until it didn't. Because eventually, it stopped being about individual moments. It became about accumulation. Too many small things that didn't quite add up. Too many times where something felt off, and I explained it away. And somewhere in the middle of all that, something else started happening. I stopped trusting my own reactions. I'd feel something shift, and immediately question whether I was imagining it. I'd notice a change, and then talk myself out of it before it could become real. You're reading too much into it. It's not that serious. She would tell you if something was wrong. I didn't realize how often I was repeating those thoughts until later. At the time, it just felt like keeping things stable. Like doing what I was supposed to do. But the truth is, I wasn't just protecting the relationship. I was protecting the version of reality I was comfortable living in. Because the moment I fully acknowledged that something might be wrong, I would have to do something about it. And I wasn't ready for that. Not without certainty. Not without something I could hold on to and say, this is real. So I stayed in that space. Half aware. Half ignoring. Until the line between instinct and doubt started to blur. And the hardest part wasn't what I was noticing. It was the growing sense that I couldn't trust myself to interpret it correctly anymore. It didn't happen the way you expect something like that to happen. No dramatic reveal. No undeniable proof laid out in front of me. No moment where everything suddenly made sense all at once. It was quieter. And somehow, that made it harder to deal with. I remember it was an ordinary moment. Nothing significant about the day itself. No tension leading into it. No argument. No reason to be on edge. That's probably why it hit the way it did. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't trying to confirm a suspicion. If anything, I was still trying to convince myself there wasn't one. But then something small happened. One of those moments that, on its own, doesn't mean much. A notification. Not even the content of it, just the way it appeared, and how quickly it disappeared. I wasn't close enough to read it. Didn't need to be. It wasn't what I saw. It was how she reacted to it. That immediate shift. The kind that happens before someone has time to think about hiding it. Just instinct. She picked up her phone a little too fast. Turned it slightly away. Cleared it before I could even process why it caught my attention in the first place. And then she went back to normal. Or at least, she tried to. If that moment had happened a few months earlier, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it. But now, it didn't sit right. Not because it proved anything. But because it fit too easily into everything else I'd been trying to ignore. I didn't say anything right away. I told myself I didn't have enough. That I was still reading into things. That one reaction didn't mean anything on its own. But it stayed with me. Long after the moment passed. It replayed in my head in a way that felt different from everything else. More specific. Less explainable. And for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Not just doubt. Something closer to clarity. Still incomplete. Still uncertain. But harder to push away. That night, I couldn't let it go. Not in the way I had before. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It felt like a question that needed an answer. And I didn't know how to ask it. Because asking meant crossing a line. It meant admitting that I didn't trust what I was being told. And once you do that, there's no easy way back. I sat with it for a while. Tried to talk myself out of it again. Tried to convince myself that I was about to make something bigger than it needed to be. But this time, the explanations didn't land the same way. They felt forced. Like I was repeating something out of habit, not belief. So I did something I hadn't done before. I stopped ignoring the feeling. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I just paid attention. And once I started paying attention differently, things became harder to unsee. Patterns I had dismissed before started to connect. Moments that felt isolated suddenly didn't feel random anymore. It wasn't one thing. It was how everything fit together once I allowed myself to look at it that way. Still, I didn't have certainty. Just enough to feel unsettled. Enough to know that something wasn't right, but not enough to define what it was. And that's where everything started to come apart. Because when I finally did say something, it didn't go the way I expected. I kept it simple. I feel like something's off. That was it. No accusations. No specifics. Just the truth, as clearly as I could say it. She didn't react the way I thought she would. No hesitation. No confusion. Just a quick answer. You're overthinking. It came out easily. Too easily. Like she had already decided what the situation was before I even finished speaking. I tried again. Something just doesn't feel right. She shrugged it off. It's nothing. You're making it into something bigger than it is. That word stuck with me. Nothing. Because if it was really nothing, why did it feel like something I couldn't ignore anymore? The conversation didn't escalate. It didn't turn into an argument. It just ended. Like it had been handled. Like there was nothing left to discuss. But I didn't feel reassured. If anything, I felt more disconnected than before. Because now it wasn't just about what I was noticing. It was about how easily it was being dismissed. And that's when the doubt changed. It wasn't just about her anymore. It started turning inward. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I had built this up in my head. Maybe the problem wasn't what I was seeing, but how I was interpreting it. That idea settled in deeper than I expected. And it made everything harder. Because now, even if something felt wrong, I didn't know if I could trust that feeling anymore. I didn't get answers. I didn't get clarity. Just a version of events that asked me to question my own. And I think that's what broke something in me. Not the possibility that something had happened. But the way it was made to feel insignificant. Like whatever I was reacting to didn't deserve the weight I was giving it. Like my reaction was the problem. And once that idea took hold, everything became harder to navigate. Because I wasn't just trying to figure out what was real anymore. I was trying to figure out if I had the right to feel like something was wrong in the first place. If you've ever been in a situation where something didn't sit right, but you couldn't explain why, take a second and think about that. And if this story is hitting close to home, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't what actually happened. It's being made to feel like it didn't matter at all. After that conversation, things didn't get clearer. They got quieter. On the surface, everything went back to normal. Same routines. Same interactions. No tension you could point to. No obvious distance that would raise concern from the outside. But internally, nothing felt settled. It was like I had asked a question and been given an answer that didn't match the weight of what I was feeling. And instead of resolving anything, it just shifted the focus. Away from her. Onto me. I started replaying everything in my head. Not just the recent moments, the pauses, the tone changes, the small reactions, but the conversation itself. The way she said it. "You're overthinking." It sounded so certain. So final. Like there was no room for interpretation. And that certainty started to affect me more than I expected. Because I didn't feel certain. Not about what I saw. Not about what I felt. Not even about whether I had the right to question it. So I started doing something I hadn't done before. I began editing my own reactions. Before I said anything, I'd run it through a filter in my head. Is this reasonable? Or am I making something out of nothing again? And more often than not, I'd stop myself. Let it go. Choose silence over the risk of being wrong. That became the new pattern. Noticing something. Questioning it. Then shutting it down before it turned into anything real. And for a while, that almost worked. Things stayed calm. No arguments. No confrontations. Just quiet. But the feeling didn't disappear. It changed shape. Instead of sitting on the surface, it settled deeper. Less obvious, but harder to ignore. Like something unresolved that kept pressing in from the background. I didn't talk to anyone about it at first. That felt complicated. Because explaining it out loud meant admitting that I didn't trust what I was experiencing. And I didn't even know how to frame it. What would I say? There's no proof, but something feels wrong? That didn't sound convincing. It didn't even sound convincing to me. So I kept it to myself. Tried to manage it internally. But the more I thought about it, the less stable it felt. Every time I leaned toward trusting my instincts, I'd hear her voice again. It's nothing. And every time I tried to accept that, something in me pushed back. Then why does it feel like this? That back and forth didn't stop. It just kept looping. Until eventually, I reached a point where I needed something outside of my own head. Not answers. Just confirmation that I wasn't completely off. That what I was feeling wasn't irrational. So one night, when everything felt heavier than usual, I sat down and tried to put it into words. Not for her. For someone else. Someone with no connection to either of us. I didn't include every detail. Just enough to explain the situation. How things had changed. How I felt. And the question I couldn't stop asking myself. Am I overreacting? It felt strange, putting something so personal into the hands of people who didn't know me. But at the same time, it felt easier than saying it out loud to someone in my life. Because there were no consequences there. No awkward follow-up conversations. No risk of it coming back into my real world. Just opinions. Detached. Unfiltered. And they came quickly. More than I expected. Some were direct. You're ignoring obvious signs. Others went the opposite direction. You're reading too much into it. There wasn't a clear answer. Just noise. Different people seeing the same situation in completely different ways. And at first, that helped. Not because it solved anything. But because it broke the isolation. For a moment, I didn't feel like I was stuck inside my own perspective. There were other interpretations. Other possibilities. And that gave me a kind of temporary relief. Like I wasn't alone in trying to make sense of it. But that feeling didn't last. Because the more I read, the more I realized something else. None of those people had to live with the outcome. They weren't the ones sitting across from her. They weren't the ones waking up the next day and carrying whatever decision came from this. They didn't have to deal with what happened after the advice. And that changed how it all felt. The opinions stopped feeling helpful. Started feeling distant. Abstract. Easy. Because it's always easier to have clarity when you're not the one affected by it. And that's when it hit me. I hadn't gone looking for answers. Not really. I had gone looking for permission. Permission to trust what I was feeling. Permission to believe that something was wrong, even without proof. And realizing that, made everything feel heavier. Because it meant the answer wasn't out there. It never was. It was something I had to decide for myself. And I still didn't know if I trusted myself enough to do that. After that, everything felt heavier. Not louder. Not more dramatic. Just harder to carry. Because once I understood that no one else could make the decision for me, I had to start looking at what that decision actually meant. And that's when it stopped being theoretical. It stopped being about feelings and questions and possibilities. It became real. Day-to-day real. I started noticing how different everything felt when I wasn't filtering it through hope. The same routines were still there, but they didn't feel the same. Conversations felt thinner. Not because we weren't talking, but because I couldn't tell what was genuine anymore. Every answer felt like it could be complete, or just enough to move past the moment. And I didn't know how to tell the difference. I found myself paying attention to things I used to ignore. Tone. Timing. Small inconsistencies. Not obsessively. Just, constantly. Like my mind wouldn't let me settle back into the version of things that felt easy before. And that changed how I showed up. I was quieter. Not in a distant way. More like I was holding things back. Measuring what I said. Deciding whether it was worth bringing something up or letting it pass. Because every time I considered saying something, I ran into the same problem. If I was wrong, I was creating tension that didn't need to exist. If I was right, then everything I had would shift in a way I couldn't control. There wasn't a good outcome. Just different versions of loss. And that realization sat with me more than anything else. No matter what I chose, something was going to break. Either I ignored what I felt and slowly disconnected from myself, or I faced it and risked losing everything I had built. There wasn't a middle ground that felt honest. And that made every small decision feel bigger than it should have. Even normal moments carried weight. Sitting in the same room didn't feel neutral anymore. Silence wasn't just silence. It felt like something unspoken sitting between us. I think she noticed the change in me. Not directly, but in the way people notice when something is slightly off without knowing exactly what it is. She asked once, casually, "You okay?" I paused longer than I should have. "Yeah. Just tired." It came out automatically. Simple. Easy. Non-confrontational. The kind of answer I used to accept without thinking. And that was the moment I realized something else. I was doing the same thing now. Giving answers that avoided the truth because it was easier than dealing with what came after. That thought stuck with me. Because it blurred the line even more. Between what she was doing, and what I had started doing in response. I told myself I was trying to keep things stable. But stability started to feel like avoidance. Like we were both maintaining something that didn't fully exist anymore. There were moments where I thought about pushing for clarity. Just asking directly. Getting a real answer, one way or the other. But every time I got close to that point, something stopped me. Not fear of the answer itself, but fear of what it would require me to do next. Because once something is clear, you can't pretend you don't see it. You can't go back to uncertainty. And uncertainty, as uncomfortable as it was, still allowed me to exist in the space between knowing and not knowing. It gave me time. Even if that time didn't feel good. I started thinking more about the practical side of things. What separation would actually look like. What it would change. Not just emotionally, but structurally. The kind of things no one talks about when they give advice. The disruption. The adjustments. The long-term consequences that don't show up immediately. That's the part no one else lives with. They don't see what it takes to rebuild something after it falls apart. Or what it costs to stay and pretend it hasn't. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. There wasn't a version of this where I walked away untouched. There wasn't a version where everything stayed intact. Something had already changed. I just hadn't decided what to do about it yet. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not the possibility that something had happened. But the reality that I couldn't avoid the impact of it, no matter which direction I chose. Because either way, I was going to have to live with what came next. It didn't come all at once. There wasn't a single moment where everything suddenly made sense and all the confusion disappeared. It was slower than that. Quieter. More like things settling into place over time, whether I wanted them to or not. I stopped asking the same questions eventually. Not because I had answers. But because I started realizing I had been asking the wrong ones. For a while, everything revolved around what actually happened. Trying to piece it together. Trying to understand the details. Trying to find something concrete I could hold on to and say, this is why I feel the way I feel. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that the specifics weren't what was keeping me stuck. It was everything that came after. The way it was handled. The way it was explained. Or, not explained. I started replaying those conversations differently. Not focusing on the words themselves, but on what they did. How they made me question my own reactions. How easily my concerns were reduced to something insignificant. You're overthinking. It's not a big deal. Those phrases stayed with me. Not because of what they meant on the surface, but because of what they did underneath. They shifted the weight. Away from the situation, and onto me. Like the real issue wasn't what had happened. It was how I responded to it. And once I saw that clearly, it changed how everything fit together. It wasn't just about whether something crossed a line. It was about how quickly that line was moved, or erased entirely. I realized I had spent more time defending my reaction than understanding why I had it in the first place. More time questioning myself than questioning what didn't feel right. And that's where something started to click. Not in a dramatic way. Just, quietly. I stopped needing it to be confirmed. Stopped needing a full explanation that would make everything make sense. Because I finally understood something I hadn't allowed myself to before. Even if it was, just once. Even if it wasn't serious, in her eyes. Even if the details were less than what I imagined. None of that changed how it affected me. None of that made the feeling go away. And more importantly, none of that made it insignificant. That was the part one had been waiting for someone else to validate. To tell me, yes, this matters. But no one was going to do that for me. Not her. Not anyone outside of the situation. And once I accepted that, something shifted. I stopped trying to minimize it just to keep things intact. Stopped trying to convince myself that I could live with it if I framed it the right way. Because the truth was, I had already been living with it. And it hadn't gotten easier. If anything, it had slowly worn something down in me. The way I trusted. The way I interpreted things. The way I felt in my own space. And I couldn't ignore that anymore. I didn't need every detail to be confirmed to recognize the pattern. The avoidance. The deflection. The way responsibility never fully landed where it should have. It wasn't just about an action. It was about what followed it. And that mattered just as much, if not more. I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a while. Not certainty exactly. But clarity. A kind of quiet understanding that didn't need to be argued or defended. It just was. And with that came something else. A decision. Not necessarily about what I was going to do immediately. But about what I was no longer willing to ignore. I wasn't going to keep questioning whether my reaction was valid. I wasn't going to keep shrinking what I felt just to make the situation easier to manage. And I wasn't going to keep pretending that something didn't matter when it clearly did. For the first time in a while, I felt aligned with myself again. Not comfortable. Not at peace. But honest. And that felt more solid than anything I had been holding on to before. Because even without full answers, even without complete closure, I finally trusted the one thing I had been doubting the most. My own sense of what was real. I don't think there's a clean ending to something like this. Not the kind people expect, anyway. There's no moment where everything resets and you feel like yourself again. No clear line where the confusion stops and certainty takes over. It doesn't work like that. What actually happens is quieter. You carry it with you. Not all of it. Not all the time. But enough that it changes how you see things. How you listen. How you interpret silence. How you react to the smallest shifts in someone's behavior. And the hardest part isn't even the betrayal itself. It's what comes after. It's realizing how easily you were made to question something that, deep down, you already understood. I've thought about that more than anything else. Not just what happened. But why I needed someone else to tell me it mattered. Why I had to step outside of my own life, look at it from a distance, and ask strangers if what I was feeling was real. There's something unsettling about that. About not trusting your own reaction enough to stand on it. About needing confirmation before allowing yourself to feel something fully. And I don't think that comes from nowhere. I think it builds slowly. From small moments where your concerns are brushed off. From being told you're overthinking. From learning, over time, that it's easier to stay quiet than to risk being wrong. Until eventually, you stop trusting the part of yourself that notices things in the first place. That's what stays with me now. Not just the situation. But how close I came to ignoring it completely. How easy it would have been to accept the explanation I was given and move on. To tell myself it wasn't worth the disruption. That it didn't matter enough to change anything. And maybe from the outside, that would have looked like strength. Like patience. Like commitment. But I don't think it would have been honest. Because the truth is, something did change. Not just in the relationship. In me. In the way I understand trust. Not as something you give once and never question again. But as something that depends on whether you're allowed to feel what you feel without being dismissed. Whether your reaction is respected, or reduced. And I don't think I fully understood that before. I thought trust was about actions. About what someone does or doesn't do. But now I see it differently. It's also about what happens when something goes wrong. How it's handled. Whether it's acknowledged, or minimized. Because you can recover from a lot of things. But it's hard to recover from being made to feel like your experience doesn't count. Like your reaction is the problem. That's the part that lingers. Even now. And I don't have a perfect answer for what someone should do in that situation. Stay. Leave. Try to rebuild. Walk away. Every version comes with its own cost. Every decision changes something. So I'm not here to tell you what the right choice is. I don't think there's a single right answer. But I do think there's a question that matters more than the rest. And it's the one I wish I had asked myself earlier. Not, am I overreacting? But something simpler. Something harder to ignore. Why do I feel like I need permission to feel this way? Because if you have to ask that. If you have to go looking for validation just to trust your own reaction. Then something deeper is already off. Whether you can prove it or not. Whether anyone else agrees with you or not. That feeling doesn't come from nowhere. And maybe the real decision isn't about what happened. Maybe it's about what you're willing to accept after it. What you're willing to live with. What you're willing to silence in yourself just to keep things intact. I still think about that. About how close I came to choosing comfort over honesty. About how easy it would have been to stay in something that no longer felt real, just because leaving felt harder. And I don't judge anyone who makes that choice. I understand it more than I ever thought I would. But I also know what it feels like to finally stop asking for permission. To trust that something matters, simply because it affects you. Even if no one else sees it the same way. Even if you can't explain it perfectly. And maybe that's where it starts. Not with certainty. Not with answers. Just with the willingness to listen to yourself, without needing anyone else to confirm it first. If this story made you pause, question something, or see your own situation a little differently, you're not alone. Subscribe for more real, unfiltered stories about trust, betrayal, and the decisions people don't talk about. Like the video if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who might need to hear this. Because sometimes the hardest truths aren't the ones we discover about others. They're the ones we finally allow ourselves to accept.